entrusted to them aggregates under their hands. They may fairly be regarded as the naturally selected agents of society for certain work. They get high wages and live in luxury, but the bargain is a good one for society.
It was a sad day when millionaires could no longer send their sons to Yale and be secure in the knowledge that they would receive this kind of instruction. As Jesus came eventually to the temple, Spencer came eventually to America. And the reception in the two cases was broadly the same. By the time of his coming in 1882, he was no longer young, he was 62, and not in the best of health. He was also averse to reporters in the press. The tour, nonetheless, was a triumph. Everywhere he was greeted with enthusiasm by men who could see in their own selection for affluence proof that the race was being improved. Spencer was not himself wholly reassuring. This was an age of exuberant pride in the American achievement, and once or twice he implied that the United States was still at a slightly primitive stage, in Darwinian terms back maybe with the higher primates. There were also some sour notes here at the Last Supper. This was a great celebration at Delmonico's restaurant, then at the very height of its fame as a watering place of the early American establishment.
We are gathered here tonight, gentlemen, to show the feeling of Americans toward our distinguished guest. The Amazulus, from whom I think a great many things can be learned for the good of the people of the present time, have a maxim. They say the continually stuffed body cannot see secret things. Now, from my personal knowledge of the gentlemen at this table, they are the owners of continually stuffed bodies.
Leaders in business, academic life, politics, and even theology were present. One speaker, Carl Schurz, said that if Spencer's books had been better read in the South,
there never would have been any war for the preservation of slavery.
Henry Ward Beecher was the most famous of American divines, and we'll see him again in a moment. He considered his own salvation completely secure.
You wear an invisible crown on your heart that will carry comfort to death, and I will greet you beyond. Amen to death.
Spencer, for his part, offered the terrible thought, if the workers happened to be listening,
we have had somewhat too much of the gospel of work. It is time to preach the gospel of relaxation.
No one at this happy gathering seems to have worried very much about a small but obvious point, and that is how the social Darwinists would bridge the generation gap. In those years, John D. Rockefeller had formulated the doctrine of natural selection for a Sunday school class in an exceptionally engaging way.
The American beauty rose can be produced in the splendor and fragrance which brings cheer to its beholder only by sacrificing the early buds that grow up around it.
The same process, pro tanto, worked in business. The weak men were lopped off, and this accounted for the splendor, though presumably not the fragrance, of a Rockefeller.
This is not an evil tendency in business, merely the working out of a law of nature and the law of God.
The question, of course, was how this same law of nature and of God would be used to explain the splendor of John D. Rockefeller, Jr., or yet later of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller and his brother David, the banker. Surely a Rockefeller inheritance, even more than a handout to the poor, would cool the struggle to survive, devastate the morale of the beneficiaries. This was an interesting problem, one that called logically for the abolition of inheritance, something that the affluent did not especially welcome. Rockefeller's adoption of Spencer and Sumner was not unique. It was only more explicit than the others. These ideas were the business ethic of the age. We should look at them now in their practical manifestation. This, above all, was in railroading. Nothing in the last century, and nothing so far in this century, so altered the fortunes of so many people so suddenly as the American or Canadian Railroad. The contractors who built it, those whose land would boom in value when it arrived, those who ran it, and those who looted it, could all get rich, sometimes in a week. The only people who were spared the burdens of wealth were those who laid the rails and ran the trains. Railroading was not a high-paid occupation in the last century. The casualty rates of those who ran the freights, mutilation, death, were only modestly lower than in a first-class war. But the railroads got built, and in the end they were operated with considerable competence and efficiency. A legion of honest men, we should remind ourselves, bent their efforts to these tasks. Still, Spencer's natural selection worked exceptionally well on behalf of scoundrels.
A railroad allowed, in fact, for an interesting choice between two kinds of larceny, robbery of the customers and robbery of the stockholders. The most spectacular struggle between scoundrels in the last century was between rival practitioners of these two basic arts. It was over the Erie Railroad running on the Jersey side of the Hudson to Buffalo. In those days, the late 1860s, a deplorable and sometimes lethal streak of rust. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who controlled the New York Central across the river, wanted the Erie to ensure his monopoly of service to Buffalo and potentially on to Chicago. His commitment was to robbing the public. Ranged against Vanderbilt was the physically formidable figure, I think some would say the gross figure, of Big Jim Fisk. Jim Fisk died of gunshot wounds at the rather early age of 36. And this was to the general regret of the better class of American citizens, many of whom thought it should have been earlier.
This is the Erie Gang, Vanderbilt's opposition. Jay Gould, an experienced larcenist, Daniel Drew, now aging and somewhat past his best, and Jim Fisk. Their commitment was to robbing the stockholders. Once an individual was in control of a railroad, there was a myriad of devices by which its cash and its other assets could be siphoned off into his own pocket. And these men were masters of every known method. To get control was the thing. In 1867, both Vanderbilt and the Erie Gang wanted the Erie. Vanderbilt wanted his monopoly. Gould, Drew, and Fisk wanted the stockholders' money. And so the inevitable conflict. Vanderbilt had plenty of money from his own New York Central with which to buy the stock. Gould, Drew, and Fisk had something even better. That was temporary possession of the Erie Railroad and of a printing press in the basement of its building. In consequence, they could print more stock than Vanderbilt could ever hope to buy, and yet enough more to keep themselves in control. And this they proceeded to do.
If this printing press don't break down, I'll be damned if I don't give the old hog all he wants of Erie.
Their position, men said, was based firmly on the freedom of the press.